Hello and welcome to Craftwork, a podcast by writers for writers.
Craftwork is recorded in Fredericton, New Brunswick, on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Wolastoqiyik, the people of the Wolastoq River. I'm Miriam Riche.
And I'm Mike Thorne. We'll be your co-hosts. The music for this podcast is composed and recorded by Randy Nickel Schroeder. William Ping is a novelist and journalist, born and raised in St. John's. His debut novel, Hollow Bamboo, was published by HarperCollins in 2023 and was shortlisted for the Amazon.ca First Novel Award, the BMO Winterset Award, and the Thomas Riddell Atlantic Fiction Award, as well as being longlisted for the Dublin Literary Award and the Stephen Leacock Medal for Humor. He has previously been published in Us Now, Hard Ticket, and Riddle Fence. William is also known for his contributions to CBC News, where he can most often be heard reading the news.
Hello, Will.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Hollow Bamboo is a pretty impressive novel. It's extensively researched, it's narratively complex, and it is on the higher end of page count, over 400 pages. That is quite the feat for a first novel. How long did it take you from the genesis of the idea for Hollow Bamboo?
Knowing the story of my grandfather's life growing up, I always thought like, oh, this would make like a good movie or a good book, or like I just knew like this was like a great story that needed to be told. So all my life growing up, I was always thinking about how could I tell this story? But it wasn't until grad school that I seriously thought about writing it. And it all began in a podcast course that Lisa Moore was offering, who's a great Newfoundland writer. And so I signed up for that course because I loved podcasts. And I had no ambition at that time of writing. But I signed up for that course, and just working with her that semester and seeing how she balanced like a real job, quote unquote real job, with the job of the writer. Because growing up, I had always imagined like, okay, I'll get like a real job first, like an engineer or an accountant or something like that. And then I'll write later in life when I'm retired. But working with her that semester and seeing the way that she was able to balance both the creative side and the more financially lucrative side really inspired me. And so I asked her then to join her creative writing thesis program. And so that was when the genesis of the idea came about of seriously writing the novel. I did about a year of research, and I would say then I spent around 6 months working on the first chapter, just doing that first chapter over and over and over again. I just really wanted to like nail the tone with that. Once the pandemic started and I realized that grad school funding was about to run out and I'd been laid off from my job, I had been working in insurance at the time. And when I realized like, oh, the money's about to run out, I gotta like get things in motion here. So that was in March 2020, and by June 2020, I had the whole manuscript done. So it took like 6 months for the first chapter and then 3 or 4 months for the rest of the book after that.
What do you think changed? Did you just develop some best practices and lessons learned? I ask because I am working on my first novel, and I can relate to this notion of polishing prose is nice, it's fun. The idea of showing someone a chapter that I hadn't worked 6 months on is more daunting. What do you think changed that made your pace increase?
For me, as crass as it was to say, it was just totally financially motivated there in that last stretch to like get it done before the money ran out. But then once it was done, I was like, okay, what am I going to do with this now? You know, it was just the manuscript. So there was lots more editing time after that. But really just having that strict deadline of knowing that the funding was about to run out was what really pushed me through on that. And I've since finished writing the second novel. And it was a similar thing with that, where it was sort of, you know, deadlines from the publisher and just knowing that I had to hit this date or I'd disappoint somebody. That was what really ended up motivating me, which is probably like not the greatest tip. But I would have like inspirational slogans on like sticky notes here behind the computer monitor that I'd look up at. One said like, you have everything you need. So that was to say like, you know, you don't need to keep researching. You've researched everything. You have everything you need, right? And so I think just having certain mindsets like that can help.
a deadline is, in a way, the best motivator for writing a novel, because if you don't have that kind of set in stone date that you are obligated to or holding yourself accountable to finishing something, the time is never there. You have to make the time, you know? How did you go about that process?
Yeah, so my process on both of the books was different. So on the first book, where most of that I wrote was during the pandemic, I'd wake up in the morning, I'd have breakfast, I'd play Animal Crossing for like 2 hours. And I found that would like kill the sort of, I don't know, distractible nature, like that would sort of like kill the desire to do something else. I'd sell all the turnips and all that stuff. And then after that, I would settle down and start writing. And then I just write until supper time. So it'd be around probably 11 a.m. till 5 p.m. or 6 p.m. I never held down like a strict, this many words per day type thing on that. It was just whatever I could get done by then, I would. On the second book, it was a totally different process because by then I had started working for CBC Radio. And my hours there typically are 5 a.m. in the morning to about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. So on the second book, I just come home from work and try to write again until supper time around 6 p.m. And again, didn't hold myself to any sort of strict word count. It was just a matter of this many hours are devoted to that task, and whatever I produce is what I end the day with.
You mentioned your work as a journalist for CBC. I'm curious whether or not you see any ways that experience shows up in your fiction writing process. For you, are they very separate things, or are there things that you have learned as a journalist that you have found useful or instructive for your work as a fiction writer?
Journalism, similar to writing novels, was something I had not planned or anticipated on getting into. And again, I credit the podcast course with that turn of events. So on the first book, I had no journalistic integrity, I guess you could say. I had the historical story, but I was sort of playing fast and loose with the facts there. In my work as a journalist, it's all facts, right? You're sort of beholden to what actually happened. Whereas in a novel, you can sort of play with those ideas a bit more and compress timelines. And, in real life, some of the events might have happened years apart, and I compress them to the same week just for the sake of the story. In the second book, I can see my style has changed a little bit because I find, especially writing news stories for radio, I'm often trying to figure out, what is the shortest possible sentence that I could use on the radio to convey this information. And so in the second book, I think my style has gotten a lot more concise. But, you still have room there to cut loose and ramble on and get a bit wacky, get a bit wild with it, right? So that's all part of the fun of creative writing compared to journalism, which is very didactic. That's the other thing. Creative writing, you can be much more indirect than with the journalistic writing.
With Hollow Bamboo, you had to do a great deal of research.
Absolutely. I mean, a lot of the research was done in the Memorial University archives. That's the local university here in Newfoundland. And just reading different historical documents or historical studies or folklore studies and interviewing family members about their memories and consulting documentaries. There's a great documentary about my grandfather called The Last Chinese Laundry. And that was a great resource too, just to hear some of the events of his life in his own words. Newspapers, historical newspapers. Anytime there's a newspaper mentioned in the book, it's a real quote from a newspaper from that time period. All of those resources. But then the craziest resource came after the book was already sold to HarperCollins, but we were still editing the book. I had started working at CBC Radio then, and one day a listener called in, and this was the wildest turn of events, just truly unbelievable. But a listener called in. Usually when a listener calls in and asks for you, you don't want to hear what they have to say. It's going to be negative. But this listener was like, hey, I think I knew your grandfather. So this woman was a folklore student in the 70s at Memorial University, and she was studying the Chinese community in Newfoundland. And she had conducted extensive interviews with my grandfather that she had recorded. And she had helped him write a memoir of his life. It wasn't completed, but it was around 70 pages. And we knew that he had partially written a memoir, and we had like a couple little fragments of it, but we never had the whole manuscript. And so when she called and said about all that, she said, I want you to be the caretaker for these documents. So I connected with her son here in Newfoundland. She had since moved on. he gave me the manuscript translated into English of my grandfather's memoirs. And so that was a really incredible document to have, because that was like truly his life in his own words. You know, you write a life and you know the events of it, but you don't necessarily know how the person felt. And so a lot of times writing the book, I imagined, well, how would it feel if this happened to me? Reading his memoir was very emotional because in many ways I was thinking along the same tracks as him, but to see the extent to which he was disappointed with his own life was really emotionally moving. It was great to know that that was his perspective on things and to be able to get those words into the book. So I took lots of little quotes from his memoirs and put it throughout the book wherever it would fit chronologically. And some of my favorite lines in the books are his lines.
What a serendipitous thing. It reminds me a bit of the Wapshot Chronicle by John Cheever. It's like a family saga, a family history. It's written kind of like a biography. He was very inspired by his father when he wrote it and thought that his father was much more poetic than him. Why would it have been that someone in the folklore department had been working with your grandfather?
That's a good question, and not something that I even really know the answer to. But I found that many of the historical studies on the Chinese community here in Newfoundland were produced in the folklore faculty. And like a lot of different ones, like histories of Chinese food in Newfoundland was in like the folklore faculty, and just a lot of the historical documents I ended up encountering about the Chinese in Newfoundland were considered folklore. Why that is, I don't know.
You're making good use of humor, but you're also obviously dealing with some very painful historical and also familial content that reminded me a bit of Eden Robinson's novel, Son of a Trickster. Was tone something you figured out over various drafts, or was it something pretty clearly planned out at the outset?
I knew from the beginning that I wanted it to be entertaining in some ways. Knowing how heavy the story would get, I wanted there to still be entertainment, which seems like an odd thing to say. But I can remember from the beginning saying to Lisa when we were talking about the book, I wanted it to be funny. In my mind, I was writing for a youthful audience, and I felt that if I did straight historical fiction, that a youthful audience wouldn't take to it. That they needed to be entertained to not be on their phone 24/7 type of thing. And so I would say to Lisa, like, oh, like, it's such heavy subject matter, like, but I want to make it funny. And Lisa would always say, like, it doesn't matter what you do, just make it beautiful. So that was another post-it note behind the computer, was make it beautiful. Generally, my writing prior to the novel was mostly sort of creative nonfiction, first-person essay type stuff, where I would always try to do like a humorous tone, and people would compare it to David Sedaris, although at the time I hadn't read David Sedaris. And so I was trying to write in a vein similar to Sedaris, I guess, unknowingly, unwittingly. And so I wanted to keep that going throughout this. There's lots of stuff in the book that's no laughing matter ultimately, but I wanted to bring that lightness into it just because it does get so dark.
I can't think about audience when I'm writing. Otherwise, I get too self-conscious and afraid. Do you struggle with that?
I think in the first book, I just didn't know any better. I did the autofiction thing because, like reading Lisa's writing or other local writers, when you know a writer, there's a tendency to look at their writing and say, hey, I know what this is referencing in their real life, and oh, this must be this person from their life, and that type of thing. And so I think that I chose to go the autofiction route on this just because I wanted to collapse all of those sort of readings of it to just be very direct and to the point and be like, yeah, that guy's me, and this person's my partner, and this is our actual names, and this was what was actually said. And then a ghost showed up, so then you knew that there was it couldn't all be real, or maybe it was, who knows. Writing it at the time, I didn't know exactly to what extent of an audience I would have. I was writing for a youthful audience in the sense that I was writing for myself as a 23-year-old at the time, thinking that probably at the end of the day, only my friends were ever going to read this manuscript in the Munn library and it wouldn't go anywhere, which turned out to not be the case. So in writing the second book, I definitely had a lot more, I don't know if I'd call it anxiety, but consideration of who the audience is, especially because, I wrote Hollow Bamboo thinking it would be read by other 23-year-olds. The reality of it is I would say the vast majority of my readers are women 50 plus. And so writing the second book, knowing like, okay, your built-in audience is not the demographic that you yourself are, definitely posed a different set of considerations for this second book. And still editing the second book, and that is still a consideration for me. To what extent should I consider the desire of my readers or my expected readers, and to what extent should I consider the desires of myself as writer/reader? And I don't think I've found that balance just yet.
How intently do you think about genre when you're entering a writing project? Do you go in thinking, I would like to write, I don't know, a magic realist novel, or is it a little more organic than that?
The sort of interplay of genres is definitely very much so part of the way I conceive the books, I would say. Like, I knew I wanted it to be autofiction, but then I also wanted it to sort of deconstruct autofiction. And I wanted it to be magic realism, and then I wanted it to sort of deconstruct magic realism. And I sort of wanted everything to be a contradiction in the way that the title of the book sort of represents this contradictory identity. And so I wanted everything in the book to be a contradiction, and everything to sort of be, two things at once, in the way that the narrator's sort of race plays into it. And with the second book, it's a detective story, but the detective sucks. And it's a romance story, but the romance kind of sucks too. And, I think that I have a lot of fun playing with the sort of genre tropes and different ideas and bouncing them off each other and mixing it all up together.
I read an interview with you in Saltwire, and you had mentioned Dickens. Obviously, A Christmas Carol is there. I find as a writer, often what I'm reading at the time just makes its way into the book. What were you reading at the time that you were writing Hollow Bamboo?
What was I reading at the time? To be honest with you, I don't think I read anything at all while I was writing it during that first draft anyways. I was definitely reading in the lead up to it, and I read quite a number of things where I thought like, oh, this might inspire me, or like this reflects sort of something I want to do with it. And so Dickens was definitely part of it, because I wanted that Scrooge journey for the narrator Will, but also sort of the Dickens time period and the way Newfoundland was in the 1930s. I felt there was some thematic similarities there to emulate throughout the rest of the book as well. What else was I reading at the time? Sedaris. Everybody said you're writing like Sedaris, so I started reading Sedaris. Madeline Tien, I was reading her. Lisa would just show up and give me books. Dennis Johnson books. Ocean Vuong. Lisa gave me a copy of Ocean Vuong where her dog had taken a bite out of the book. It was her second copy of the book that the dog had tried to eat. So obviously there's something very delicious for dogs in Ocean Vuong's writing, and inspiring for the rest of us as well. But yeah, Dickens was definitely the big touchstone. I was reading too, I think it was called Stories from a Chinese Studio by Pu Songling, because I wanted that interplay of cultures. So this book was sort of a collection of ghost stories, Chinese ghost stories. And, so I wanted that sort of interplay of Western ghost stories and Chinese ghost stories. And at the time I was thinking a lot about hauntology and Mark Fisher, and was reading a lot of graphic memoirs. I think much like what you said, it was like whatever I was reading for grad school at the time was sort of finding its way into my thinking on the text in general.
I think you said your favorite novel is The Great Gatsby. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely.
It's one of my favorites too. I actually just reread it this year. I had a Fitzgerald kick because he was one of the most formative writers for me. So I'd reread that and Tender's the Night and The Beautiful and Damned. What is it about that novel that resonates with you? When did you first read it? Do you remember your first encounter with that book? I guess I just wanted to geek out about Fitzgerald with somebody.
I think I first read it when I was in high school, and it was probably when the DiCaprio movie came out, if I was to guess. Or it might have been before that, I'm not quite sure, but I remember reading it in high school and just being quite taken with it then, and then returning to it again over and over again over the years, and just always finding more in it. And I think you can see its influence in Hollow Bamboo as well, just in the way that Nick is this sort of like third person, first person, and then the way that like narrator Will takes on that sort of perspective when he first travels back in time. And there's actually one point where there's a direct quote from Great Gatsby in Hollow Bamboo. It's the part where When Daisy is in Gatsby's house and she's picking up all the shirts and she's like crying into the shirts and saying these beautiful shirts, like I can't remember the exact quote, but that exact line shows up in Hollow Bamboo during one of the laundry washing scenes. All throughout the book, I've got direct quotes from other sources mixed in there just to sort of contrast the privilege of the Gatsby world with the sort of harrowing conditions of the hand laundry. Other parts of the book, you've got famous quotes from Newfoundland politicians, and again, sort of taking this like famous political high class quotes and then putting it in the mouths of Chinese laborers who didn't have the same sort of status in society at that time. Another influence on the book was Lovecraft, and a few direct Lovecraft quotes show up as well, just because I wanted that sort of weird fiction vibe and, you know, the strange way that he deals with race. Strange is perhaps undercutting it quite a bit, but, you know, I wanted to bring that sort of menacing vibe into the text and recontextualize some of his words.
Weird fiction has this kind of slippery quality, and your book has a slippery quality in genre terms.
Yeah, I really enjoyed like Robert Chambers, The King in Yellow, like that type of stuff too. And I don't think I have any direct quotes from that in there, but that was probably something I was reading in the lead up to writing this as well.
Did you ever read Algernon Blackwood by any chance?
That I have not, no.
He's also very genre slippery. He kind of weaves in and out of the Gothic and the weird, and of course the weird comes from the Gothic.
Algernon Blackwood is great. I also really like Robert Eichmann for weird fiction. A very like adept prose writer. I like how you wove those in there. That's an interesting idea. Did you see another writer do that before?
You know, if I had done an academic thesis, it probably would have been on intertextuality. And so I was always thinking about the relationships between texts and sort of the way that those relationships can sort of shine new and interesting lights between the texts. So I think I was thinking of how to place the novel in that sort of relationship with these other books that had inspired me. Even if nobody ever figured it out, that, you know, it was something that was entertaining me throughout it anyways.
I think even if no one figures it out, it's still there on a subconscious level. That intertextuality and that play and tension is still felt. Is there much of a distinction for you between having written a novel inside of academia and now embarking on or having completed a draft of your new novel outside of academia?
One way that I feel the difference is the editorial process. It's a very different process of having a thesis advisor to bounce ideas off of and send every little new page of work to and get feedback on. And then sort of the grading process and other people she would bring in to help consult on it, compared to now without the sort of safety net of academia and just writing it for, you know, my editor and my agent to review. It's definitely a very different process of, you know, how many cooks are in the kitchen or how many hands have passed through it. So I do miss that in some regards, for sure. You know, I love other people's ideas. I love, you know, consulting with people and seeing what they think of things and having criticism of things. I mean, that's really the only way to improve your work. And so when you don't have as many people looking at it, you don't have as many people improving it. When you're in school, you have more of a focus on school, I think. You know, you do have an advantage in that way, too, of like, this is kind of your job. And then when you're not in school, it becomes kind of one of your two jobs. So I enjoyed the academia aspect of it for sure.
What's a piece or maybe several pieces of writing advice that have really stuck with you? It could be for better or worse.
You know, the piece of advice that I mentioned from Lisa of making it beautiful was really my guiding star throughout the book. You know, whether knowing sort of the dark places it goes to, knowing my own tendencies to just make it funny and stupid. In terms of other writing advice, Chuck Palahniuk, I don't know how to say the name, but the Chuck Palahniuk book on craft definitely was an influence on Hollow Bamboo, especially because he gives very clear, concise points on how to manipulate the reader, really is kind of his whole, you know, it's like, I remember one of his points is like, make your main character an orphan, because then the reader will have sympathy for the main character right away. And you almost wonder, like, is he being sarcastic or ironic when he says some of these tips? You know, he's so blunt with it. But I remember reading that and being like, okay, so I'll kill one of my one of my grandfather's parents, which ended up ironically being proven true in the memoir. You know, growing up, I always heard about my grandfather's mother, so my great grandmother, but I never heard anything about his father. And everybody I'd asked in the family, you know, what did you know about his dad? Nobody really knew. So I imagined, okay, he must have died when my grandfather was young. So I did some historical research on, you know, what sort of issues were there in Chinese society at that time, and sort of imagined a death based on that. And then as it turned out later on, when I received that memoir from the folklore student, or the former folklore student, you know, he detailed in there how his father had died when he was young. And his father had died, and I don't know if it was a mistranslation, it was sort of a weird cause of death. It said that he drank too much cold water on a hot day. I wonder almost if that's a euphemism for something. You know, it seems very odd. But then he writes about his grieving process with his mother and his grandmother, and those elements made it into the book. When I was writing this, Lisa and other people at the university would say, you know, there's a large possibility that you're going to piss off your family members by writing this. But luckily, almost none of my family members ever read it, so I didn't piss anybody off. You know, people will buy the book. That doesn't mean they're going to read it.
Yeah. This Make It Beautiful is interesting to me. It's so subjective and abstract. I kind of like how malleable it is. And I mean, beautiful can mean different things to different people. When you think of books from a craft perspective, which books truly have made it beautiful?
Well, you know, I'd have to think of Lisa's writing herself, right? You know, I think of her short story collections like Open, and just the way she would say so much with so little sometimes.
Make It Beautiful makes sense to me. My sticky note would say make it authentic, which is similar.
What does that quote mean to you? If it was a sticky note behind your desk as you were working on this novel, it does strike me as a really interesting thing to hold the book together.
In terms of making it beautiful, I was trying to think of ways to make it transcendent, which is another sort of very subjective term that could have no meaning. But there was definitely moments where I felt like I had landed a feeling that I would describe as transcendent, especially in the latter parts of the book. I really feel that the make it beautiful impulse comes through in some of those final chapters where my grandfather's character reflects on all the events of his life. There's two chapters in particular towards the end that throughout the editing process, when I'd returned to them, just reading them made me so emotional, which sounds conceited, I guess, because I wrote them, but the emotions they conjured for me were beautiful. And I think even if it never came through to a reader, it was at least beautiful for me to create something that made me feel that way. So the result of that guiding principle was to try to create something that emotionally moved me and then hope that it emotionally moved other people. When we were doing the book tour, there was a man in Cape Breton that I met, and as soon as he met me, he started crying because he was also a quarter Chinese, and he saw so much of his own family's story in the novel, and he felt such a powerful connection to it that, you know, he just burst into tears when he saw me. And that was a really beautiful moment because I knew then that I had made it beautiful for at least one other reader, you know. There was lots of readers that I've met that I knew loved and enjoyed the book, but just that deep connection that he felt with it, if he was the only one that felt that way, then the whole thing was worthwhile.
What do you struggle with the most in terms of process?
Probably the scenes that keep the wheels spinning and set up the next thing. I won't say which scenes so that nobody knows which scenes, but I can think of scenes in this book where information had to be relayed to get us to the next part of the book. And there's two chapters in particular that I was never happy with. And one of them I was eventually like kind of happy with, and the other one I was still not too pleased with by the end of it. And it's not even exposition, but it's just sort of a scene that sets up the next set piece, so to speak. The sort of connective tissue between the major events. I find that can be troublesome. And you mentioned authenticity there. And that was a question for me as well. All throughout this book was authenticity, especially dealing with a historical story where ultimately I didn't know everything, right? I couldn't know everything. And there were some things I just didn't know, and nobody seemed to know, like the question of my grandfather's father. And so authenticity was a thing that came up for me a lot while writing that as well. I remember after submitting the thesis and it was sent out to other people to read, one piece of feedback I got was that, so much of the book felt like a sitcom. And you had to wonder, where do you draw the line there of the sort of deliberate artifice of the sitcom and the real story of, the Chinese community in Newfoundland, and specifically the chapters set in China. And there was a question there of authenticity and how do you make that more authentic? And during the editing process, the decision I came to was there was no way for me to make that more authentic. The only thing I could do was, in fact, to dial up the inauthenticity. Some things I just don't know, right? That was something that sort of freed me from the question of authenticity was, you know what? We can't be authentic. Let's just be authentically inauthentic.
I can really relate to what you're describing in terms of those, I guess you could call them mechanical scenes, or scenes that have a kind of utility, that are moving characters from place A to place B, for instance. They would seem the most simple, like readers probably just pass them over, but they can be the most daunting. And as I was listening to you, I was kind of thinking, especially for a novel like this, but with your second novel too, now that you have the experience of producing Hollow Bamboo, do you go into a novel with an outline? Are you a pantser? Are you somewhere between?
So neither book did I really do a strict outline. With Hollow Bamboo, knowing the story of my grandfather's life and sort of the arc of his life, I knew which dramatic beats I wanted to hit, in what order, and what sort of had to be accomplished. In terms of like the day-to-day writing process, it was very loose and freewheeling. I'd wake up and I'd play Animal Crossing and there'd be a squid in it, and I'd say, okay, there should be a squid in the chapter today, and then, do some quick historical research on squids and find a way to get a squid into the book. And so it was all very loose, and just knowing like, okay, I need to hit this beat and this beat and this beat. How can I have fun in between that? But always with the ending in mind for both the books. As soon as I start the book, I like to know what my ending is. And so with Hollow Bamboo, I knew exactly how I wanted to end the book. And it was just a matter of how do I get back to that point? In the same way with the second book, I knew what the ending would be going in. Though I must say that early readers have not been a huge fan of this ending of the second book. So the question then becomes, for me now at this point, do I change the ending, or do I need to make changes to the build up to the ending? The ending obviously wasn't signaled clearly enough. So, it becomes a question then of, do I change the narrative in the lead up, or do I just change the way that it finished? But to me, the ending is so important in both books. I kind of think of the novels as like statements, and the ending is sort of where you get to have that final say of like, and here's where I tie up the bow, and here's my last word. It's hard for me to change an ending afterwards, because for me, the whole thing has been leading up to that. So to answer the question, I don't outline, but I do know where we're going to end up, and then everything in between is building on that or referencing that. I try to have it echo throughout the book, knowing the ending, and then in the lead up, writing all the other chapters, looking for places where I can sort of echo what the ending will be ahead of time.
A book, it never feels completely finished, but how do you know when it's finished for you enough where you feel ready to submit it to an agent or a publisher?
To me, it all depends on the date of the deadline and how late I can push it. No, it is a matter of, it's a good question, because I think it's one of those things that you almost can't put words to. It's like a feeling of knowing like, okay, we're far enough now, I can show this to somebody, knowing that there'll still be 40 more drafts after this, or, exaggerating a little bit, but you just feel like, okay, I'm as pleased with this as I can be, given the circumstances. Now I have to set it loose. And with the first book, it felt like constantly editing it. And every time I thought it was over with, I get an email from somebody else saying, oh, we want to do this, or we want to do that, or what do you think of this, or what if you did that? And it seemed like an endless process. And so that never felt finished until literally until I saw it in other people's hands, the physical book, right? Like once the book was out, I was like, okay, now it's over. Like now, now the nation is free from this nightmare, you know. I call it a nightmare, but it does have its pleasures all the same. It feels like you're never free from it, really. Even now, you know, as I mentioned, there's still scenes in Hollow Bamboo where I say, oh, I wish I could have done something with that, or, you know. The second book I was more pleased with, though, you know, there's still much work to be done. The second book, I didn't have any scenes that still stand out to me as this needs major changes. Whereas Hollow Bamboo still has scenes in it where I think I could have done better.
I've been noting as we've been talking to you, you use terms like set piece, sitcom. I know because I follow you on Letterboxd that you are a cineast. Is watching film part of the process for you? Do you find it inspiring? Or is it just a leisure activity that you do that is completely unrelated to your writing practice?
I definitely find it inspiring, especially during the writing of Hollow Bamboo. I think I was trying and successfully watching at least one movie every day. And for much of grad school, it was like that. And I think, you know, of course, it is partially a leisure activity for sure. You know, I am enjoying it. But I think my thinking on that was that I wanted to study as many narratives as possible. And so to me, it was like, okay, the fastest way I could do that is like do one movie every day. If I watch one movie every day, I'm seeing like one story every day being told differently every day. And I do think a lot of that comes through in the writing. A lot of people have described the book as feeling cinematic. And I think you're quite right that a lot of that does come from my media diet, so to speak, of, you know, this is the sort of stuff I'm taking in, so that's the sort of stuff I'm pushing out. And movies play a big role in Hollow Bamboo as well, I think, narratively, especially in the later chapters, as sort of a form of escapism for the Chinese community. And I think movies play that role for many people to this day. Sort of a place to go. You can go there alone, you can go there with people, it's something to do, it's relatively cheap, and it gives you an escape from your world. And I think generally we think of escapism as, you know, like superheroes or sci-fi or that type of thing. But for me, I think of any sort of story as escapism. You know, you're sort of briefly taking a peek into someone else's world and having the empathy for that world or lack of empathy and so on, right?
A lot of people, when they talk about writing, they talk about stakes. I think there is a feeling of escape in being swept up in or invested in a set of characters.
I was kind of thinking of it in those ways, and I was thinking of, to me, like Hollow Bamboo has this three-act structure, three-part structure of the narrator Will chunk, the first year in Newfoundland, and then the last chunk where time sort of zips by at a very rapid pace. And I think that was an extension, too, of my desire to make the book entertaining. And again, thinking of writing it for a youthful perspective, I was thinking of, okay, every so many pages, I'm going to like totally change the way the story is being told. Because in my mind, I was thinking like this is a way to engage a reader whose attention might be elsewhere, you know, with phones and TVs and whatever else, right? So I was thinking, okay, every so often we're just going to completely change the way we're writing this novel. So the last chunk of the book, I was sort of thinking of like Sopranos seasons and how each episode of The Sopranos is like a short story on its own that sort of connects to the other episodes, but like you can kind of pick it up anywhere and sort of exists as its own concrete piece.
Do you have any intention of exploring other modes of writing?
Yeah, definitely. I'd love to do screenwriting, love to do a collection of short stories, love to write for comics. You know, any type of writing I'm interested in it. And I hope to dabble in every form. Documentary, that's another thing, documentary I'd like to do, which is similar to journalism, but especially in regards to Hollow Bamboo, I'd love to do a documentary where I go to the village in China where my grandfather's from and take the same methods of transportation to get back to Newfoundland. That'd be my dream documentary to do that. Whether or not it's possible, I don't know. I was just in Hong Kong last week, actually, and I'd never been to Asia at all before. And, you know, speaking again of things we'd like to change in our books, having now been to Hong Kong, I was like, oh man, I wish I could change the Hong Kong chapters. Having now actually seen Hong Kong, I'm like, oh man, I could have I could have gotten it more accurate.
How did you approach it before having not been there? I mean, it's a hard thing to do if you haven't been to a place. And I'm also curious to hear why you felt that way. Was it something ineffable, or was it something kind of concrete that you noticed that you thought, oh, I wish I had captured this?
In terms of how I wrote those parts of the book, or the parts where he's in other parts of China, or even steamships, or any of that stuff, I often was trying to find contemporaneous footage. So I was looking at a lot of newsreels. And later on, when we were editing the book and trying to figure out the sources of stuff, I found it difficult to even find the same newsreels again, like a couple of years later. But I was watching old newsreels of the war in China and the Sino-Japanese War and that type of stuff, just to try to get a feel for what it was like there and what it looked like and how the people were dressing and how many people were there and all that type of stuff for the early chapters. And then in the later chapter, when he's in Hong Kong in the 90s, I was definitely drawing from like Wong Kar-wai movies, which, having now been to Hong Kong, although it's many years removed from when Chungking Express was made or something along those lines, I could see the romanticism that Wong Kar-wai has compared to the reality of it, which makes it sound like I didn't like it there, but I actually loved it there because it was so different and so unique from anywhere else I'd ever visited. And what I found fascinating about it was that the Hong Kong that Wong Kar-wai depicts, though romantic, structurally, very much so, it's still the same Hong Kong. The fleet of cabs are like cars from the 80s that they just keep repairing, and all the scaffolding there was made out of bamboo with barbed wire, and there was so many little details like that. Having experienced that now, I would have made some changes for sure at the end of the book, just in terms of fleshing it out to make it more authentic, or my feeling of what is authentic. Instead, I'm writing about McDonald's signs reflected on bathroom tiles and stuff, and that's very much so a vision from Wong Kar-wai.
That's an anxiety that I often have in my writing. I mean, I spend a lot of time on Google Maps or YouTube. It's not the same because conventional writing advice always relates to, well, first of all, you walking into a room is different from anyone else doing so. So the things that you notice would not necessarily, if it's being mediated to you through someone else's authority, that's not going to be as good. But also just the multi-sensory, the atmosphere, it is kind of limiting. Have you read anything that's excited you recently?
I've been making my way through the Beckett trilogy, which is a very different type of writing than probably what I would try to undertake. But that's been a really fascinating reading process. I'm on the third book there now, and it's really amazing to watch how Beckett's style gets more and more pared down through the books. Because you start in the first one with Molloy, and he's so funny and wacky and crazy. With each one, it just gets darker and darker and more deconstructed. And it's a really amazing type of writing that I don't think I would be capable of. It's not in the Sedaris mode, so it's not it's not something that I'm going to emulate, but it's really, really a great use of language throughout there. And I believe his writing process was that he sort of barely knew French, I think, to my understanding. And he wrote it in French and then translated it back to English to try to really pare it down, right?
I know that Nabokov does that as well with his books. He translates them back and forth between Russian and English.
And that was another Hollow Bamboo influence, Pale Fire. The humor of it and the sort of the way it plays with narrators and all that sort of stuff definitely found its way into Hollow Bamboo. And Trust Exercise by Susan Choi was something I read after I wrote Hollow Bamboo, but I was like, oh, this is definitely in the vein of what I was trying to go for, the way she plays with narrators and that.
Yeah, you recommended that to me, and I read it, and Mike read it too, and it was a stunning book. Kind of reminded me of, I read something after, have you read Less Than Zero or Imperial Bedrooms by Bret Easton Ellis?
I've read American Psycho, but I haven't read anything else by Bret Easton Ellis.
Those two together, if you're interested in this kind of metafiction, those would be of interest to you. But the second one is like kind of about the writer writing the book. So it has that trust exercise thing going for it.
American Psycho is definitely a big influence on the second book, I would say.
Both that and Beckett are playing with tonal dissonance. I find Beckett kind of terrifying as well. I remember the book The Unnamable had like this deeply paralyzing terror in it.
I'm just starting that one now, but like the ending of Malone dies is like terrifying too. And just the way that wraps up is just so, I almost found it shocking, really. Really didn't expect it to be so scary.
I've only read Waiting for Godot, which I read when I was like 19 and kind of hated. But
I think that's
but
a classic.
now,
That's a classic
yeah.
experience. During university, I tried to go back and read all the books that were assigned during high school because I definitely didn't read them at the time. You know, it was all like Sparks Notes type stuff for me. And then returning to them later when you're not being forced to read them is like such a different experience.
Oh, definitely. I only read The Great Gatsby and Wuthering Heights like last year, and a friend of mine was dubious about my Goodreads. But I was like, well, if you read it when you're not 16, it's pretty awesome. Which one? Just out of curiosity, what did you reread from high school?
So it wasn't even like rereading, it was actually reading for the first time, I would say. Animal
Oh,
Farm,
yes.
Catcher in the Rye, Newfoundland books like Death on the Ice, that type of stuff. Like basically anything that was assigned at that time, I did not read. And then returned 2 years later and was like, this is good. Which, like, of course it's good. I feel like everybody gets taught Animal Farm. And I think there's a propaganda-esque element to everybody being taught Animal Farm. Because it's like, while you're still a child, you just get this book where it's like, communism will never work. Only capitalism. Here's a little fairy tale about it. And I feel like they sort of make everybody read that to sort of ingrain that lesson in you. That was my thought on returning to Animal Farm, which I enjoyed, but I was kind of like, oh, this is why we all had to read this. But luckily, none of us read it at the time, so I don't know.
Thank you so much for joining us, Will. Where can our listeners find you?
You know, I have a website and I have Twitter and all that stuff, but I never really update either of those. If you want to find me, the best place to look at is Instagram at the ping to the pong. And that's where I keep all the updates, all the latest of my life, all the latest updates of what my cat is doing and, you know, where is he today and which part of the house is he laying down in. You can find all those latest updates on my Instagram.